5 books and counting. The Tales from the Omni Vault continues to expand as a universe. Go ahead and check the links down in the description to get your copies today. Hello ladies and gentlemen, I am the Omni Viewer, and this is Omni at the Movies, where today we'll be discussing Godzilla Kong: The New Empire. Now, this review is going to be spoiler-free because as of this posting, the movie has just come out. I'll do a spoiler video after opening weekend, but for now, don't worry, I'm not going to give anything away. I'm also going to keep my promise and not compare this movie to Godzilla Minus One because, as we could all tell, they really are totally different from each other. I don't really think there is any way that you can draw parallels between them and go, oh yes, these movies do something exactly the same right here and here and here. You really can't do that. So, not going to bring that up again. I will tell you that it is definitely not in the same tone as Minus One, for starters, but, you know, otherwise, not going to say anything about it. So, overall, how is it? I would say that it is really, really fun. Is it perfect? I don't know about that. But where it's strong, it is very strong. The weakest aspect, which I'm sure we were all expecting, was with the human characters. Although I wouldn't say it's a total wash. You see, unlike Godzilla vs. Kong or Godzilla King of the Monsters, or really any of the previous monsterverse movies, the cast here is very streamlined, if you will. Basically, we're following 4 human characters around the whole time. And that keeps things relatively simple. It does actually feel kind of like those later Showa movies where we're predominantly following a small group of humans who are there to help keep the plot moving in certain ways and explain things that might not be obvious, but otherwise they're mostly there for that purpose. We're not going to get to know them that well. They're not going to be especially complex or anything. But that's not to say that they're pointless. They do have personalities, so we can at least know a certain degree of who they are. Obviously, 3 of them are carried over from Godzilla vs. Kong, and briefly, I do want to say, I do think they improved Bernie a little bit. He's still mostly there for comic relief, he still spouts crazy stuff every once in a while, but he feels a bit more grounded, a bit more focused. So, minor improvement over the previous movie, but, you know, he's still, again, mostly there to be there to keep the plot moving. As for the new character, Trapper, who I have to wonder if that was an intentional MASH reference or not with naming him that. His personality is pretty easy to tell right off the bat. He's sort of a punk rock genius, if you will. Punk rock in terms of his attitude, not in terms of the fact that he's actually a musician, because he's not. Although he does have a fondness for music, none of it punk. But his character, you get a pretty clear read on it early on, so you're like, okay, know who we're dealing with now, and we basically follow them throughout. They are very much the secondary characters of this story. Make no mistake about that. So they're not going to have the biggest emotional arcs. Not that they don't have any. They do have some, but like, they're not going to get as much focus as what the monsters are getting. Still, though, they serve their purpose well, I think. They're not going to be making anybody's list of best human characters from a kaiju movie. But for the role that they are assigned, and you could argue in the greater scheme of things it's a very thankless role, they do what they are supposed to do. There are other human characters sprinkled throughout to provide little bits of commentary here and there, but for the most part we are focused on those 4. And their stuff does tie into the monster stuff, maybe not necessarily in the most incredible ways ever, with one possible exception, but again, I'm not going into spoilers here. But overall, you know, they're not what we're going to see the movie for, and the movie clearly knows it. So They do what they are supposed to do, but they're not going to be blowing anybody away. Then again, since they're secondary characters, they're not really supposed to. There is no doubt about it, Godzilla Kong the New Empire belongs to the monsters. And they are the ones who carry this movie. You may have heard that there are large chunks of the movie where it's just the monsters in focus and no humans there at all. Or if they are, they're mostly there to just do a little side commentary. Well, it's true. I would say that at the very least half of this movie is monster-focused. And that's like an estimate. Obviously, I didn't time it exactly, but I would say much of this movie is focused on them. Now, you might be wondering who gets more of a focus, Kong or Godzilla. You may have heard that, once again, this is a very Kong-centric movie, and yeah, it is. He does get more screen time than Godzilla, but I also think they struck a bit more of a balance than in Godzilla vs. Kong. Godzilla's got plenty of screen time in this. Again, he doesn't have as much as Kong per se, but there are plenty of moments where it is just him as well, and we see him doing his thing. So don't be too upset. Godzilla is not in the background just yet. Even though Kong is more in focus than he is, that doesn't mean he's out of focus. You may have noticed that in a lot of the posters, Kong is in the foreground and Godzilla is standing just behind him. I think that's kind of a visual representation of how the screen time is divided up. Mostly focused on Kong, but there's still a lot of Godzilla. And in terms of that characterization, I mean, you know, I've said in the past, and the debate keeps coming up about making a kaiju movie that would be predominantly focused on the kaiju with little to no human stuff. New Empire is the closest we've got to a movie like that at this point, and I think it is a very strong argument that such a movie could work, because the stuff with the monsters is really, really well done. With Kong's side of things, obviously Kong is far more humanoid and human-like than Godzilla, so he's more capable of obvious emotions and whatnot. So that's probably why we're following him a bit more. But his story is very easy to follow. We can tell from the whole thing, without even needing the human commentary that eventually comes in, that he is exploring, he's searching for more of his kind, because that's why he went down into the Hollow Earth in the first place. He was told there might be more of him down there, and he's looking, but he's not finding them just yet. Of course, eventually he does, which also brings him to that guy. I'll get to him in a moment. But we're following him around in this, and eventually he does meet Tsuko, and they wind up having a little lone wolf and cub adventure down in the Hollow Earth, where they're getting to know each other, figuring out some kind of a dynamic. At first, Tsuko doesn't fully trust Kong, but they eventually grow closer. And you can tell how it's working out purely by watching it. There is some Genndy Tartakovsky levels of visual storytelling here. Maybe not to the same extreme, because Tartakovsky works with very exaggerated animation. But you can still tell what's going on. As for Godzilla, well, as mentioned, he's not as humanoid. He doesn't express emotions the same way as Kong, but you can still tell what's going on with him as he's venturing around the surface of the Earth, gearing up for the battle he knows is coming. And there are moments where they provide commentary with him more so than with Kong. And I'd say most of it isn't necessary. Like, again, without getting into spoilers, there's this one moment where we clearly see Godzilla entering into this place, and then we hear a human voice who's observing it saying, "Godzilla is entering this place." I'm like, yes, thank you, sir. We can see that, but I appreciate that you need to put food on the table, so I won't hold it against you. So you don't need the commentary. It's still there. But I would say if you removed it or you muted it or something, you'd still be able to tell what's going on with Godzilla just as easily as you can tell what's going on with Kong. But what about the newcomers? Of course, there's Scar King. And at this point, the action figures from Playmates have been out long enough. I don't think it's much of a spoiler to talk about Shimo. But, of course, there are certain details about Shimo I can't give away. So I will keep that part brief. For Scar King is the main antagonist. And he's basically meant to be Kong's antithesis, I guess you could call him. He is the exact opposite. Whereas Kong is a benevolent and caring creature, he's just evil. Scar King has no redeeming qualities to him at all. He is just mean and evil. He does not have anything sympathetic about him. He's not making any good points that people might latch on to. He's just the bad guy. And we need more of those these days, I think. But he's also really good at being evil. Like, he's the kind of villain you love to hate. Because he's so evil, that makes him work. With Shimo, again, I don't want to get into too many spoilers, but Shimo's slightly more sympathetic. But not necessarily in a contrived way. Like, you can sort of tell once they explain Shimo's deal where the story is going, but the journey to get there still, I think, works out, feels natural, and ultimately, I think they're good new additions. Zuko as well. Zuko, like I said, he's got that sort of kid tag-along for the grizzled old hero dynamic. And he has an interesting arc of his own, one that, again, does not need commentary in order to understand. So, they're good additions, I think. I've always said that what I want the Monsterverse to do is to keep bringing in new monsters in addition to classic monsters. I love seeing reinterpretations of the classic monsters, obviously, but the new monsters could be really interesting. You know, the Mutos and the Skullcrawlers were really cool, though they kind of served similar purposes in retrospect. I'm not saying they're bad, I'm just saying functionally they weren't really different in any way other than appearance. King Ghidorah, of course, escalated everything, but he was a legacy monster. Scar King and Shimo, they up the ante. They are not just ravenous monsters that are going to destroy everything because they're out of control and need to be put down. Scar King has a plan. Scar King thinks. He is devious. So, again, good additions, I think. If we can see more new monsters and even recurring ones portrayed in these ways, and I think the future of the Monsterverse will look pretty good. I suppose the best way to know if you're likely to enjoy Godzilla Kong the New Empire is to ask yourself this question. How much do you like the fantasy genre? Because that's what this movie is. It is 100% high fantasy. It's not hard science fiction. It's not even soft science fiction. If you couldn't tell from the fact that we have an evil king in an underground kingdom of fire who controls an ice dragon, we are talking about German power metal band adapting the books of J.R.R. Tolkien while playing a JRPG levels of fantasy in play here. So, do you enjoy that? Is that the sort of thing you like? Because if you do, you're gonna like this movie. It's, like I said, pure fantasy. Escapist, fun, not really asking anything of you other than to just sit back and enjoy the ride. And I feel like if you are the sort of person who's open to that genre, you're gonna enjoy this. Certainly the monster side of it. And also, well, I can't get into this part without getting into spoilers again, so I'll probably discuss it more in that spoiler video when I do it. But the movie actually does stuff that I haven't seen done in kaiju movies before. Like, maybe I've seen some of it done in movies before in general, but for a kaiju movie, these are things that generally haven't been done because, well, there could be any number of reasons. For the longest time, it was because the technology wouldn't allow that sort of thing, or the techniques being used. But we're now at a point where they can be done. And since we're seeing them done that way, it's really interesting to see. And you combine that with the fact that this is largely monster-focused, well, that makes the new Empire stand out. And it stands out in a good way. I mentioned briefly on Twitter a couple days before this posting, well, I suppose it's X now, whatever, that a kaiju movie that was mostly focused on the kaiju, if not entirely focused on the kaiju, would actually be more of an experimental kind of film than any of the so-called surface-level experimentation from the Reiwa period up to this point. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, one of the defenses I've heard for the Reiwa period, specifically the stretch that ran starting with Shin Godzilla, going through the Polygon trilogy, and concluding with Singular Point, that's like the early Reiwa era, a main defense I've heard is that it's experimental. It was at least trying new things to get Godzilla away from the same old rut, and that alone should give it merit, regardless of whether the outcome was good or not. And I disagree wholeheartedly. First of all, that being experimental overrides having a good outcome, but also that these movies were even that experimental to begin with. The experimentation they did was mostly in regards to what the monsters were, particularly with Godzilla. So in Shin, he's a constantly changing, giant-sized zombie. In the Polygon trilogy, he's a mountain-sized plant. In the Singular Point series, he's a weird, non-Euclidean, Lovecraftian, geometric whatchamacallit that will destroy the universe simply by being in it. Okay, those are very different from his traditional origins of being a prehistoric creature that had a bomb dropped on his head. But what are the different movies actually about, or series in this case? They're about Godzilla showing up, the military attacks him, he's going to destroy the city, they have to stop him. Oh yeah, never seen that one dozens upon dozens upon dozens of times over the last 7 decades or so. You see what I mean? It was surface-level experimentation. They weren't actually doing anything new with the stories, the plots. And as a result, claiming that it's experimental is really just an attempt to deflect criticism away from these things. But a movie that was mostly focused on the kaiju? That's something we haven't seen before. So that actually would be experimental. This movie is getting really close, and I have to say, it worked. The stuff with the monsters in it, it really does work. And they even do things with it that they could have done if it was still a human-focused movie, but because it's attached to this particular film, it's just another part of the experimentation. And again, I do think the experimentation pays off. Sure, it's not a profound movie that meditates on the human condition or anything, but that's not what it's trying to be. It's escapism. That's okay. There is nothing wrong with escapism. And the fact that this escapism is also able to do some new things with the genre, I actually think that's worthwhile. So, when you get right down to it, yeah, I did enjoy my experience here. I think Godzilla Kong the New Empire is good. Again, maybe it's not the greatest Godzilla movie ever made or greatest Kong movie ever made or what have you, but it is a fun fantasy adventure that's just a nice way to take a break from the daily grind and have fun at the movies. You remember fun? We should have more of that, because life keeps throwing us hardballs these days. A little escapism will do us some good. And I think it'll do you guys some good too. So this movie gets my recommendation. We'll move on to spoilers in the next one. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni Viewer signing off. Thank you all for watching. Now be sure to head down to the description to check us out on other platforms, as well as find links to the 5 current books in the Tales from the Omni Vault universe. Again, thank you all, and we'll see you next time.